Yeah. Hear the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory be to you, Lord.
One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him." And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to you, O Christ.
So please be seated. I wonder, when is your oldest, earliest memory? When I was young, I could remember the first flat my parents had after they got married. And I think about 2.5 years old when they left that flat. And I can remember maybe hiding behind the sofa and seeing the living room and things in it. And the picture was there, and I didn't realise what it was of until I saw a photograph of the flat, and then realised that's what it was. And the thing is now, it's such a long time ago, it's a kind of memory of a memory now. I can remember remembering it, but I'm not quite sure if the thing I've got in my head is the thing which I actually saw. But I can also remember when I was tiny, when they bought their first house, in those high and far off days in the 60s, young couples used to go off and buy a house. Do you remember those, that kind of thing? Doesn't seem to happen much nowadays. But they did that. And it must have been quite exciting because it was a kind of new build of, houses on the edge of town, and all the people, the young couples are going out there at the same time in life and everything. So there's lots of mixing, lots of socialising, all that kind of thing. And I can remember going out in front of this house and seeing this enormous expanse of concrete ahead of me. And there's this little bike thing, and borrowing it off a neighbour, some little kid that lived nearby, and then going out across this enormous expanse of concrete, just doing this circle on this little tiny bike. Anyway, that memory was quite vivid for quite a long time, and eventually I went back as a teenager with Mum and Dad, and I looked around for this enormous expanse of concrete which I used to go cycling on this tiny little bike, and I realised it was actually the road. It was actually just a ordinary two-lane road, quite a narrow road actually, but when you're only like 3 years old it seems huge, it seems to stretch out into the distance in every way. And so gradually, you grow up. And I think it's quite good to sort of remember these things, as you grow up, because they're kind of part of you, aren't they? They kind of form you gradually. As you grow up, gradually kind of all these things kind of stick to you and you become who you are, basically. It is sort of part of who you are, and I think it's good to kind of acknowledge, that's kind of where we've come from. You come from your upbringing, from your ancestors, whatever they are, and gradually you remember things, you make choices in life, some better, some worse, and you become who you are. And it's a kind of mixture of your environment, your inheritance, and the choices you make is what you do with these things as you go along. But at some point, you get to this point where you kind of wonder who you are, who am I kind of thing. Some people never really ask the question, and others it becomes quite perplexing. And I think we understand ourselves in the context of what you might call our inheritance, things which we've been given, our upbringing, our families, the places where we live or have lived, all that kind of thing. and in how we understand these things. And I think the way we tend to interpret them, in other words, the way we tend to understand our circumstances and ourselves, is actually often in the context of stories. I think stories actually have a really, I feel like, important function in human life for us to understand ourselves. It's how we kind of understand who we are, how we deal with people and situations and things. And I've noticed that if you, for example, if you study ethics in philosophy, you end up telling each other stories to try and discuss ethical issues. And I realised that as I was growing up, I used to come and take advice from stories. I'd see people do things in stories and think, well, that's a good idea, I think I'll do that. And then I'd try it out and see if it worked. Sometimes it's a good idea, sometimes it's not such a good idea. But often the idea that the kind of fabric of a story can help you to kind of put things in a way which you can understand and somehow assimilate it, somehow you can make it part of yourself. And so, at some point though, you kind of bring all these things together and you kind of think, well, what do all these things mean? How do all these things kind of fit together? Because you need to kind of continue to reinterpret yourself. You need to continue to kind of deal with what's happening and what's going on around you, with the things that the choices you've got to make. And this is an ongoing process. And I think the psalm here describes that really well. The Psalm 139, O Lord, you have searched me and know me, you know when I sit down, you know when I rise up, you discern my thoughts from afar. The psalmist is kind of gathering together everything at once, all these things, everything that's happened to him. He says, you knew me when I was in my mother's womb. When I was being formed in the depths of the earth, you saw my unformed body. When as yet you knew all my days, and as yet there were none of them. Everything about me, O God, you know. But then the psalmist defines himself in the context of the knowledge of God. Where shall I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Sheol being a word for the grave. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, in other words, from the east to the west, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the night about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day. The night, the darkness is as light with you. If you humbly take stock of yourself, you realise the Lord knows everything about us. We're completely exposed to God. We can't hide from Him, and we can't escape Him, and we can't evade Him. Where can I go from your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? It's going to be everywhere, wherever we go. It's inescapable. That thought could make us claustrophobic. Or we could, if you like, yield to it. And that's, I think, a good response. Just kind of accept it. There is nothing we can do about that. It is simply who we are and where we are. We're made in the image of God, and we live in this world which He has made, and we're part of it. And that's simply what we are. This psalm is described sometimes as including what you might call wisdom. It's a kind of interpretation of life. It's kind of how things are. But also it contains clues about the relationship to God. O Lord, you have searched me. The name Lord is the name of the covenant, the name of the God who saves and has a purpose for us. It's not just the name of the Creator. The word God is used in the context of the Creator. Search me, O God, and know my heart. But the word Lord is used in the context of the one who speaks, if you like. And so the psalmist is, if you like, presenting himself before the Lord. He says, how precious to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast is the sum of them. And then he says, do I not hate you, those, O God, who hate you? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? He's distancing himself from what you might call evil. He realises there's a difference between good and evil, and he wants nothing to do with the evil. He wants to keep that at arm's length. And then offers himself to God. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Of course, for us, there are grievous ways in us, which we need to be, if you like, led away from. So, to actually say sincerely to God, search me, O God, and know my heart, it's going to be slightly disquieting, because there are things about us which are not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And part of our proper, you might say, humility before the Lord is to know that imperfection, to own it, and to submit it to the Lord. But we do so knowing that He is kind, that He is gracious, that He is compassionate, and that we trust in that kindness and that grace and that compassion that He will gentle us. But He will also be honest and truthful, and thereby we will be, you might say, corrected. And in this story from Mark, we actually have the Son of God. I mean, no one around him understood that at the time. No one around him actually understood who he was. And as Mark was writing this account, he was writing it in order that people would understand who he is. So these stories are meant to tell us not so much about what Jesus thought about the Sabbath, but about who Jesus is. And by the way, you get to know a bit about the Sabbath as well. And I was wondering why the significance of this thing about the Sabbath, because the whole Sabbath observance thing, it becomes quite irksome, quite burdensome at times. And the Pharisees had a vision that if they could get the Israelites to be good Israelites and do everything properly, to properly avoid wrongdoing, then the Messiah would come. That was their plan. That's their strategic plan. In other words, make society perfect and then everything will be great. So they thought if we make rules so that people obey the rules, then society will become perfect. But it became very, very difficult to actually do them. And they became quite harsh at times. It became very burdensome and very difficult to manage. And actually became quite onerous. And when it came to it, none of them could actually get it right anyway. So there's this kind of paradox. They want everyone to do the right thing, but in the end, no one actually does, in spite of all the rules. So they just thought, well, obviously there aren't enough rules here. We need to make more. So they just kept on putting them on. So by the time Jesus came along, there was loads of them. They had this idea that if there's a kind of fence, this is what you don't do, then to make sure people don't cross the fence, they're going to draw another fence in front of that one. Then to make sure they don't get any closer to that, they're going to do another one over here, kind of thing. So by the time Jesus is actually there are so many fences outside. People think, where are we supposed to be going? And this is the context of this thing about the grain on the Sabbath. Because technically speaking, they might be described as harvesting and winnowing, which is work. You're not supposed to do that. And that was their complaint against Jesus. Your followers, they're harvesting and winnowing on the Sabbath. That's not on. And Jesus says, they're hungry. They're not farm labourers bringing in the harvest. They're a bunch of blokes that are hungry and they're nibbling on bits of grain. There's a difference. But then he also makes a point about how David ate the showbread from the tabernacle. The same place, actually, where Samuel was ministering. By that time, by the time of Samuel, there had been a tent pitched there, and probably replaced the cloth once or twice, for about 300 years. Moses got there about 1400 BC. So by the time Samuel's a little boy, it's about 1100 BC. So for about 300 years, there's been this tent pitched there. And then gradually, this complex had grown up around it. Originally, it was just a tent, and the priests would stay in their tents a little way off, and then they'd come in to do their business. And gradually, they'd put up sheds, and they'd put up barns and buildings and stuff around for convenience. And in the middle of it all was this tent, possibly. But by this time, the walls had kind of grown up around it. So it wasn't a proper formal builded complex, but it wasn't just a campsite either. It was the kind of mixture of the two. And so out there, they would just put out the bread. Every week, they'd make fresh bread. They'd put it on a table in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting, in the mishkan, the tent, the dwelling place in the name of the Lord, the sign of him dwelling among the Israelites. And it's a sign of his provision of bread. A sign that he would give bread to his people, that he would feed them and provide for them. It was also a sign of his words, a sign of his providence, a a sign of his care for them, a remembrance of the manna. Of all these things all kind of layered together. And once a week the bread would be changed over, and the old bread, when it was taken out, was only allowed for the priests to eat. And David, on the run from Saul with his men, runs into this place and he meets one of the priests. He actually met the father of this guy Abiathar, but Abiathar was a man at the time, so he's probably hanging around at the time. And he said, "Have you got any bread? We're hungry. We're on business from the king." David was a little bit disingenuous then. "Have you got something for us to eat?" He said, "Well, I've only got the showbread." And then the priest thought for a minute. He said, "Well, have your boys been good boys recently? You haven't been with any naughty girls or anything like that?" "No? Okay, well, you can temporarily become members of my household then, and you can eat the showbread." And then they ate it, and then off they went. And Jesus somehow alludes to that story as being the proper provision of bread, properly feeding men who are hungry. But he also makes the point about the Sabbath being made for man. And you think, well, what's this got to do with him himself? He is the son of David. And then he describes himself as Lord as the Sabbath. But Mark knows this is the Son of God. Who are the Pharisees to question the Son of God? It's preposterous when you think about it, isn't it? It's kind of so stupid. They're saying, "We don't reckon you're quite understanding this properly." And Jesus is saying, "Really? You reckon? Did you honestly think I don't quite understand what I meant when I said this to Moses all those years ago? You don't think I knew what I was about then? No? Really?" Anyway, I mean, the irony is extraordinary, isn't it? But he wants them to take to heart the fact that he is the one who gives his people bread. He is the one who gives rest. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who will bring his people home and give them rest. He is their provider. That's what he wants his friends to know. But he also wants the Pharisees to know that as well. And in the next story, he's angered, it says, by their hardness of heart, but he's grieved. It's easy to think that Jesus is in these endless contentions and he simply sees them as enemies, but he sees them as people. And he wants them to understand. And he challenges them. Now, again, it's this thing of work. If you're a doctor and you're normally paid to do work, then work is what you do. Then, healing is what you do. So that means on the Sabbath, the doctor, strictly speaking, shouldn't make house calls unless it's an emergency, and that's exactly what the Pharisees said. If it's an emergency, fair play, go and do what you need to do. But if it's not an emergency, you wait till Monday, kind of thing, wait till the next day. But Jesus didn't actually do any work. He simply said, "Stretch out your hand." This wasn't his paid employment. And talking is not work. So that means, by the Pharisees' definition, Jesus did not do work, except that it was healing. So there's a kind of paradox going on. Healing is kind of work, except Jesus didn't actually do any work. He didn't get paid for it, he didn't exert himself, he simply spoke. Speaking is not work, QED, he didn't do any work. What's going on? But again, Mark wants us to know who Jesus is. He is the one who restores our bodies. He is the one who gives us rest. He is the one who makes us new. He's also exposing. He wants the Pharisees to take to heart that they are actually trying to do him harm. They wish to harm him. They have come to the synagogue explicitly to harm him. And he's saying to them, how can that be lawful? You're criticising me for not being lawful by healing this man. How can it be lawful for you to plot me harm on the Sabbath? How does that work? How can that be consistent? You're contradicting yourself. And again, Mark wants us to take this to heart. But the point behind all these things is Jesus shows himself who he is. He never explicitly describes it. He simply shows them. The reason being that he wants us and them to see who he really is. Because it's easy to think, I know who he is, and then kind of project your imaginary picture on top of it. And what he wants us to do is to see who he really is. if you like, to listen to him. And that was the thing about Samuel, he listened. The name Samuel, Shmuel, means God hears, or God heard. He is the one who listens. Eli didn't listen. It's a kind of tragic story. He didn't listen. And he ends up in this story of judgment and condemnation because he just would not listen. But the Pharisees wouldn't listen either. And that's why Jesus was grieved, because they just would not listen. They wouldn't see what was in front of them. The disciples saw it and didn't get it. But they kind of showed willing. And that's really what the Lord would like of us, I think. That we would show willing. And so if we kind of realise that once we've seen this is a kind of treasure within us, this is a kind of light within us, that we're still jars of clay, but then this treasure is still in us, even though we're jars of clay. And like the psalmist then, we can start to understand ourselves. We can know who we are. We can know where we've come from. We can know our story. We can know what to do. We can start to interpret our signs and our wonders. We can understand who we are and where we're from, but more than that, we can understand where we might go as well. And so I think that's just how these things work together. So I suppose what I want to take away from all these things today is to try and see him for who he is, the Son of God, the giver of rest, the one who will restore our bodies, the one who will give us bread, the one who will speak kindly to us and speak to us if we will listen.